So let's make a start. So welcome. My name, as I mentioned before, is Grace. I'm the director of the Center for Asian Christianity from the Brisbane School of Theology. And the CAC is our vision is to be an Australian hub for the acceleration of the gospel in the Asian church. And so one of the areas of our mission then is to amplify and encourage engagement with theologians and writers from the Asian and Asian diaspora, writing from that social context. And so hence it is my pleasure to introduce Dr. Daniel Dealey, who oversees the Asian American Center within the Fuller Theological Seminary. And personally, whom I consider leaders in this space. So we probably can't hear, but please welcome Daniel. Is this your debut in Australia, I guess?
It is. It's my debut in Australia.
Yeah.
Thank you so much, Grace. Very, very good to be here.
Yes, it's such a pleasure to have you.
Should I just share my screen and start?
I'll just ask you a couple of quick questions.
Oh yeah.
Yeah. For those of you who have been following our social media, you may have already gotten to know a bit about Dr. Lee from our introduction to his book and some of his other credentials. But I thought we might get to know you a little bit more personally this morning. So perhaps you could tell us a couple of things about yourself, your family, and perhaps what a typical week for you would look like.
Okay, typical week. There are a lot of administrative meetings because I run the center as the academic dean for the Center for Asian American Theology Ministry. So there's a lot of things that I do for the seminary itself. I'm also this year serving as the co-chair of the Diversity Council, so overseeing diversity for the seminary altogether as well. And I've done that work before. So there's a lot of those meetings. I usually teach like a class a quarter. We're on a quarter system. So I'm teaching a class this quarter on Theology of Grace, which is actually very personal to me, which is why I got into this business in the first place, to be a theologian. I wanted to care about grace and the gospel, and I realized, man, how do I do that? And I realized, wait a minute, why are we having difficulties in the Asian American context? So I ended up getting into all this Asian American stuff. It's like a byproduct because I wanted the gospel stuff. So it's not the fact that I was somehow super interested in Asian American stuff. Usually every day I make lunches for the kids. I have 3 daughters, so I'm the one who's on duty in the morning. So I make, they don't like school lunch because it's bad. So I make them lunch in the morning. I walk my sixth grader to school usually. And then I come to the office, I teach. A lot of times I'll teach online. And especially how Grace took one of my classes in the past. And then usually a couple of times a week, I go rock climbing in a gym. That's what keeps me sane. I think the work that we do is quite stressful because there's a lot of cultural, racial dimension to it. So, and then during summers, I might go rock climbing, like go hiking or whatever. So it's part of what I do. I just shared my Facebook, and it's the same Instagram as well. If you want to see what I do, I make that kind of public just because this is basically like by my work and my life. I want people to see especially in my life, because I want people to realize the fact that if you don't really have a robust life outside of work, some of the work that we do can be quite stressful. So you have to figure out how to take care of yourself well, right? Practice Sabbath practices. So yeah.
Yeah, that's really helpful. And yeah, I do remember that in class we were talking about it and how helpful that was for me. Yeah, I've definitely noticed a lot of climbing photos from your Facebook. I'm curious, what kind of school lunches do you make for your daughters?
I make I'm Korean American, so I'll sometimes make kimbap, which is actually like rolls with some vegetables and crab sticks or whatever. I'll make that. I'll make pasta with some bacon and sausage. I'll make because I like food a lot. I don't want to serve them something that I wouldn't eat. That's my standard for anything. Never serve something I wouldn't eat myself. So I'll make spam musubis. I don't know if you've seen that before.
Oh,
fried
nice.
spam. So I can make that in like 30 minutes. Like I can make 8 of them like in 30 minutes, 9 of them in 30 minutes. So because in the morning I gotta get like 6 in the morning, which is way too early for me. So some of that,
Nice.
Today I just fried up some dumplings, so I just said that. I gotta switch it up because my second one, she does not like regular food, like same food every day. So she's like, no, it's gonna be different. It can't even be predictable. She's like, I don't want like spam musubi Mondays. I don't want that. I want it to be different. So I was like, all right,
Okay.
I'll just make it kind of random. So that's her personality. So
That's nice. I mean, yeah, some of us like we don't even have spam musubis mostly in Australia much. I think it's very rare to see. So when I do see like onigiri or musubi, I'm very excited. But yeah, no,
It's
that's
so easy to make. It's so easy to make, and
yeah,
it's kind of it's like a little sandwich, right? It's like an Asian sandwich, so I like it.
yeah, that's so true. Cool. Thanks for sharing that. Okay, so just I'll just explain a little bit about this morning. It's structured actually quite simply. We're going to hear from Dr. Lee for approximately an hour or so, and that will be followed by a Q&A time. If you've got questions during his lecture, please jot them down in the chat and we'll have time to address them after. So I've got all the questions from the registration process. But I think as Dr. Lee will probably try and address most of the questions in his lecture, but if there's anything remaining, we will start with the ones in the chat and also the registration process, and then after that we'll open the floor for questions. So thank you, Dr. Lee. We'll give the time to you.
Yeah, and I promise that I will answer all of your questions and you'll completely be satisfied. Actually, that's not true. So let me give you some expectations. What I'm trying to do is give you a way of discerning God and thinking, right? Nobody can do your work for you. Even within Australia, there are different contexts and different communities. So the question is, what is God doing in your context, and how do you attend to what God's doing? So if that's the goal, I'm trying to help you give you tools to think. And in that sense, there's some questions that I'll address, but it won't be. Hopefully, it'll be a beginning. It's a long journey. This has been a long journey for me, about 20 years or so, ever since I got into ministry. So think of it that way, right? And the slide, I'll go quite fast, but I'll share the whole slide with you. And some of the holes, you can you'd have to read the book because if you want more details on that, right? Because you won't be able to get all the information. I mean, I teach a whole class on this, and so every section can be for a couple hours, and obviously we won't have all the time for that. So think of it that way: the fact that I'm giving you an overall vision, and then you have to figure out, okay, how do I kind of equip myself on the long journey? Okay? So let me if I can, let me share the screen. All right. So this is my little presentation. And so contextualized discipleship for Asian Australian Christian. And for that Asian Australian Christian. I tweaked it a little bit to kind of make it more contextual for your context. And so hopefully, it'll make sense to you. There's three major sections. And one's just on comparing US, comparative kind of demographics to understand where Australia is. And for me to understand, also for you to understand how US is different and UK is different and Canada is different as opposed to Australia. And the second section is just talking about the idea of anything being contextual. And the third section is about talking about specifically about ministry. So let me get to kind of one section at a time, okay? So this is actually the Asian American Center. Our vision is to research, equip, and resource the Asian American church. We train and support Asian American leaders, whatever their ministry might be. And when we say Asian American, we actually mean people of East Asian, Southeast Asian, and South Asian descent. So we have Indian Americans, Filipino Americans, and so we basically kind of help train all of them. And also multiracial Asian Americans, because US Asian Americans are up to fifth generation, right? So the majority is second, third generation, but it's up to fifth generation, sixth generation. So it's a lot of people. 170 years of Asian American history, a lot of adoptees as well. We want to make sure we can include everybody. And how do we do that? There's a particular way of doing that. And so that's basically what we've kind of spent a lot of time on to make sure that we're a very inclusive place. We can kind of help people. In one sense, that the lumping of Asian is in some sense problematic, right? Because if you have Koreans or Filipinos and Chinese, well, even Chinese as opposed to Taiwanese, all that stuff can be kind of problematic in some sense. But at the same time, so in that sense, there's an umbrella term, and then there's a particular ethnic identities, and they both matter. So I talk about the fact that they both matter. Okay, so that's just about the Asian American Center. Let me go over this compared demographic, because I want you to understand how different US is as opposed to Canada, as opposed to UK, as opposed to Australia. I share this in my class because I added this recently, Grace, because I realized it was helpful for me, and also helpful because I do get students from UK, I do get students from Australia and Canada as well. So I want them to understand how their context is different. So this is what US looks like in terms of demographics. It's about 6% Asian, right? Asian American. And all this stuff I'll share so you can kind of, I'll go quite fast. The biggest is Chinese, next by Indian, next by Filipino, and then you got like Korean, Vietnamese, Japanese, and other, right? This is basically what it looks like. This is not necessarily the representation of the church. So you probably will understand this as well. What the demographic looks like is slightly different than what you see in your Christian circles, right? Because Christian circles sometimes won't have as much, like, Indian Americans, for example, or whatever, right? So if you look at Protestants or evangelicals, you'll see a lot more Koreans and Chinese. But if you include like Catholics, you'll include Filipinos and Vietnamese as well. So anyways, this is basically what US looks like. Now compare this to Canada. Canada, a lot more Asians, right? A lot more Asians. But the breakdown is different because there's a lot of South Asians. And because Canada doesn't really think in terms of racial categories like Asian American, everybody's in for like more ethnic identities. So there's no like one identity that pulls these Asian Canadians together. There's no such thing as Asian Canadian identity in Canada. So that's important to know, that depending on how your country categorizes people, it'll impact how you think about yourself, right? Because US is so racialized, and a lot of it depends on what you look like, and this idea of like, you being white or black or Hispanic, brown or Asian American is a thing. And US talks so much like that in our media and in our governmental kind of demographics, that racial dimension gets highlighted. In some sense, it's helpful to see the racial dimension, but in another sense, it obviously it has limitations too, right? Because everybody gets lumped together. In Canada, they don't actually use a lot of racial categories. So even though there's racism, people can't really see it that much because they don't have language for it. So once again, think about Australia, right? This is what UK looks like. It's similar to US, about 6-7%. But when they say Asian in in UK, they definitely mean South Asian. They separate. It doesn't mean East Asian, because usually, typically in the US, when you say Asian or Asian American, people usually think East Asian, like Chinese or Korean, like. But in UK, when you say Asian, they mean South Asian, right? Indians, Pakistani, Bangladeshi kind of, right? So now compare this to what it looks like in Australia. When you look at Australia, you realize, and this was kind of hard to get in terms of specific demographics, but because Australia actually tries to figure out, what is it, your parents? So there's multiple ways how Australian demographics function, from what I can understand. It's like, where were your parents born, or what's your ethnic heritage? But or they don't actually use ethnic heritage. It's like it's almost like because they don't actually use this particular category called Asian either. Even though the racial thinking in Australia is very strong, right? Like white Australia policy. I mean, think about the fact that they excluded, just like the US, like, Chinese and Asians coming at all in terms of immigration. So you can see, and then you can see the fact that Chinese are quite big, like US, but because there actually is no Black community, it's basically just Asian, and then it's actually Aborigines or native. And that portion is quite big. How Australia kind of organizes itself and thinks about its demographic is very different. So once again, it's how the nation categorizes you and how that impacts how you think about yourself. Why is this important? Because our identities are always interactive with our context, right? So if people see you in a particular way, that'll become part of how you think about yourself. Anyways, I just wanted to put that out there because when you think about why US's context is different than Canada context or UK, if you have relatives in other places, why some people don't think as much racially as US. This is the reason why. I mean, US emphasizes racial categories continually. And you'll see it in our media, but it's not as strong in other places. But it doesn't mean you're not having a racial experience. You just don't have as much language for it at that point, right? Okay, so that's basically what it looks like. Now, given that, let me talk about this idea of theological contextuality, which basically just means, does the context matter? And in what sense does the context matter? When I think about any kind of theology, and even in my book as well, I always say start with God. If things don't matter for God, then I'm not really sure if it should matter for us as well, right? I mean, just a basic question. Does this matter for God? This is something that God cares about. If God cares about it, we should care about it. If God does not care about it, we should not care about it. And it turns out that in the Bible, there isn't like a one-size-fits-all interaction that God has with us. This is what I mean. When you see how God interacts with different people in scripture, whether it be Esther or Paul or Moses or Ruth, like God doesn't say the exact same thing to every single person, which is odd. You would think that God would say, oh, well, Moses, you're a child of mine. I have a wonderful plan for your life. So if you live in me, I'm good, right? You're good and you are obeying me. You would think that God says the exact same thing to Moses as opposed to Paul, as opposed to Esther or Ruth or whoever. But that's not what ends up happening. We don't have a one-size-fits-all interaction between God and us. God actually cares about where we are and who we are. So whether it be Esther in the Persian Empire or Paul under the Roman Empire or Ruth, who is actually not even part of God's people, or whether it's Moses under the Egyptian Empire, like God actually sees and says, oh, this is what the calling is. It's a very particular thing, right? And so this is what we're talking about. Like, it's not only so much the fact that the gospel is translated into different places. God actually says, oh, this is where you are, and this is where I'm leading you. This is where I'm commanding you, and this is what your journey looks like. This is what I mean by contextuality, or like the fact that context matters to God. Not only to us, it matters to God. Because we know our culture and language matters, but it turns out that that actually registers and matters to God as well. And when you look at the Gospels, there's 4 Gospels, and they're all in the same context. They're all, men, and they're all Jewish men. At the same time, their interaction with God is slightly different. Why is it different? Because God actually sees what Matthew is doing. And what God's interaction with Matthew looks like is slightly different than God's interaction with John. And so some people in history, like theologians in the past, they didn't like this. They thought it was a kind of an embarrassment. Like, what's wrong with this? But I think this is a clear reflection about how we matter to God. God's actually interacting with us back and forth, not like, oh, this is a universal truth and we just kind of take it and apply it to wherever we are. God is a living God, is basically what I say. And God actually speaks to us, seeing who you are. And so kind of as a summary, I say God is a God of the covenant in the sense that God actually cares about who you are. And it goes back and forth. In the Bible, God is a God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. God is not just the abstract, universal, principle, like, spiritual principle. God actually makes a covenant and interacts with God's people. God's got a creation in the sense that our bodies matter. I mean, I don't think people realize that we will all resurrect, and resurrection and our bodily resurrection is part of salvation. If you know Apostles' Creed, you say, I believe in the resurrection of the body. Well, I'm like, that's what we say, but do we believe it, or do we think the salvation means we just leave the body? It's actually more of a Greek philosophical idea. It's actually not a biblical idea. Biblical idea is the fact that our bodies are saved as well. Now, in my class, I used to say, when you resurrect, what body would you resurrect in? This is my Asian American class. And some of the students said, I don't know. And I said, do you think you'll resurrect in your Chinese bodies? And one of the students said, I don't know. Like, aren't we supposed to be resurrecting in our glorified bodies? And I was like, do you think glorified bodies are white bodies? Right? And it made a lot of students think, like, wait a minute. So I'm stuck with this body forever, but I don't want to be stuck with this body forever. And I said, oh, this is interesting, right? What does it mean for us to be saved and redeemed in this body as well? And of course, in the Bible talks about the God of the kingdom, that God brings a particular kind of kingdom and powers and principalities and all the evil that's happening in the world. God seeks to rule over these things. So given that, this is a really important point. If this doesn't really matter, then we're just talking about cultural politics, right? Oh, we want things to be more Asian or not. Because all this matters, we say, oh, God might be saying something slightly different to our community as opposed to some other community. We can still learn from everybody else, but there is a particular thing that God's saying to us. And I'm not going to go over the next slide, but I just want you to look at it. It's this idea of the fact that does the Bible condone like this color blindness? It doesn't really matter who you are. I don't know if you've heard the fact that no matter who you are, God loves you. And I say generally that's not true. It's God loves you as you are, right? Who you are actually matters to God. It's not like, oh, it doesn't really matter. No, like Peter Lou's journey matters. I'm looking at you. Like your journey matters, like who you are, your family background, your culture. It actually matters to God. God's like, oh, I see you. I see you, and that matters to me. Therefore, I'm going to lead you in a particular way. It's not like, oh, it doesn't really matter. Like, I'll just give to Peter whatever I gave to John over in Canada. That's not actually true. Now, you can learn from that interaction, but God actually sees your situation and who you are, and God's saying something particular to you, right? So some people think, hey, there's no dividing hostility, wall, separation. Galatians says there's no Jew, no Gentile, slave, no free. So, okay. And, Colossians talks about, once again, no Jew, no Gentile, right? So circumcised, uncircumcised. Ephesians talks about Christ is our peace, destroy the dividing wall. And I think based on this, people say, oh, all the distinctions are gone now. And I'm like, have you read the whole Bible? Like, God has made a covenant with Jewish people, and the church is just grafted to Israel. That's what Romans says. Israel still stays. We're just grafted because we're not Jewish people, right? Significant differences remain. First Corinthians talks about the fact that there are different bodies and different parts are there. It's not like there's one part and we're all lumped in. And different differences remain. So Paul basically says, oh, I'm called to Gentiles. Like there's a difference. Like our churches, some of our churches need to focus on Asian Australian communities. Like that is like what Paul's saying. I'm called to Gentiles. You are called to Jews. In some sense, some of our churches need to focus specifically on certain demographics. Not exclusively, no church will be exclusive, but that's actually part of, it can be God's calling in a sense. And the last thing is the fact that our differences still remain in Revelation. You would think, oh, one race, all the distinctions are gone. We all speak one language. I'm like, actually, it doesn't say that. All the differences actually matter. So this is actually really important. The fact that people think because hostility and division is gone, everything's gone and we're all just one lump people, like one soup. And when in fact, the Bible doesn't really say that. And so given that, I always talk about the fact that there actually is no command in the Bible that says, thou shalt be more Chinese. I know sometimes my friend's grandmother, might tell him like, oh, you're really Chinese, you're not Australian. But I tell people, actually, there's no commandment like that. The Bible doesn't say that. What the Bible says is that all of who you are has to be in Christ. That's what we're trying to do. We're not trying to make people more Asian. We're trying to make people all of who they are in Christ. That's what the goal is. And because of that, we care about the Asian bit. It's not because we care about the Asian bit just by itself, right? That's an important distinction. I think a lot of people, I always have to remind them in our center, when we have students, I say, you might look at me and the Asian American Center as a place where I'm going to try to make you more Asian. And I always say, I'm not your mother. I'm not your grandmother. I don't care who you marry. I don't care what language you speak. That's not my agenda. I don't even think it matters to God. But what does matter is that all of who you are is in Christ. And Christ rules over all. That's important. That thing God cares about, right? And that is an important distinction. I think some people think, well, yeah, let's be more proud of it. I'm like, I don't think that the Bible doesn't say that. So the goal is, how do we make sure the gospel comes and transforms all corner of our being, right? Now, in the US context, we say, you know what? There actually is a particular ministry in the sense that there actually are particular hurts. So whenever I describe any kind of a contextual ministry, right? Um, and and I don't mean like Asian ministry is contextual and predominantly white ministry is not. That's already a contextual ministry, by the way. I think people, Hillsong is a contextual ministry for predominant white people. Like, if you understand that, you realize, oh, everything is contextual already. That some of these things go by just the fact that they're Christian. Whenever people say gospel culture, I always kind of laugh. I'm like, do you mean white gospel culture? Do you mean white, gospel culture? Because sometimes that dominant culture kind of hides. And so we want to make sure we make that explicit and say, well, what do we really mean by this, right? So when we talk about anything particular and why I think we need Asian Australian ministry, I would say, what are the particular hurts of the community, right? That God wants to heal. You might leave your immigrant church to be like, I'm so sick of my immigrant church. I want to go to, white mega church. And then you might realize the fact that there are particular hurts that you have that the ministry doesn't address at all. What happens to that hurt? Nothing. The gospel doesn't really heal that part. So you want to make sure that that hurt gets healed. That's basically why we talk about anything contextual. There is a particular reason why. It's not just trying to be more Asian. Like I said, I don't think the Bible cares about that. That would be more like a ethnocentric agenda, which I don't think the Bible really kind of cares about in that sense. But there is a sense in which the particular hurts God desires to heal. There are particular sins that we have, and the particular sin picture is our performance. All of us know that sometimes our performance is a great blessing, but is it always a blessing? We all know that's a trap as well. It's a double-edged sword, and sometimes it's an idol. I think somebody asked me about just all the driven culture, right, of performance, education, and grades. In some sense it's a blessing. Other sense, I think it's an idol. I think this is how we sin. And some people will be like, oh, this is great. And I would say, I see this for about Asian Americans all the time. I'm like, oh, I think this is how we sin. But if you don't know our community, you won't know the fact that this is literally how we do idolatry, right? Now, am I saying this is always the case? No, but I'm saying you have to discern, and this is a possibility for us, right? And the last thing is, what are the particular gifts that we have? This is actually a picture on the bottom is actually a picture of Muslim Americans who are at this Japanese American incarceration camp. During World War II, they put all this Japanese American, not Japanese, okay? People who were like second generation Japanese American as well, they put them in camps and say, you are not American. And, these people have never been to Japan. Like, they just had to scrub themselves. And a lot of people who actually said, and a lot of people during the time try to abandon every part of them being Japanese, right? So afterwards, they try to intermarry. Everybody just left all the Japaneseness. But the people who actually kind of owned it and say, wait a minute, this is wrong what they did to us. Well, I'm American and they treat us wrong. They start supporting people who are marginalized. Once again, if you understand who you are and you struggle with that, that's the gift. And they were able to be supportive of all the Muslim American community who were being, discriminated against and marginalized, and really terrible attacks happening. And Japanese Americans were the first to say, we're going to support you. So there's a particular gift that we have, but the gifts come because we're owning who we are. There's a question about that. What's our contribution? I'm like, our contribution comes when we own who we are and we wrestle with God. Our contribution does not come when we are thinking about contribution to the world. So that's our particular vocation. What are the healing? What are the transformation? What's the contribution? And so when we talk about contextual ministry, that's what we mean, right? And the reason why we need that is that I know a lot of people A lot of Asian Americans, I know, like they left predominantly white mega churches during the pandemic when all this AAPI hate was happening, racism was happening, because a lot of these white churches said nothing. Even some churches who are really like did all this kind of work for Black Lives Matters, when the racism against Asian Americans were happening, even in San Francisco, like San Francisco, where all the attacks were happening as well, they said nothing, like not even a prayer, not even like a little announcement, even though they did all these events for Black Lives Matter. And so Asian Americans are like, this is crazy. We're invisible. We're not even seen here, right? And so a lot of them left those white churches and went back to Asian American churches. And they realized, well, we have a particular, I mean, of course, you know, there are pros and cons of everything, right? But there was something there. Were we even seen? Were we even seen? Right? So I think that's basically part of what we mean when we say contextual anything. It's not just saying how do we affirm Asian values, but how do we think about Asian values as something that we have to wrestle with? That's very different than saying, oh, how do we put a rubber stamp on Asian values? I mean, obviously, all of us know that some of our Asian values are problematic. All right. So, anyways, so let's talk about this. Okay, what does Asian Australia mean? What does it mean to be Asian Australian, right? And I'm gonna give you some language, and this is actually a big. So the last section and this section are basically like what the book is about, right? My book called Doing Asian American Theology. I introduced, so I basically had this metaphor of saying, hey, you know, I'll keep on picking on Peter. So Peter is, Asian Australia. You're in Australia, right, Peter? Not if it's true. Yeah. So you're Asian Australian. And the question is, what does that mean? What does that mean to be Asian Australian, right? Because your education, most likely, if you grew up in Australia, is pretty white, right? It doesn't really have, it might not even include all the history of white Australian policy, where the contribution, how they interact with Chinese immigrants in the past. It might not even include that. And you're definitely not going to learn about Chinese history here. So, and of course, even cultural background, whether it be about Confucianism or whatever, it'd be difficult to learn. So you're like fish in water, but you can't really articulate the water, right? It's hard to articulate that. So how do we articulate that? And what's in the water? And this is a huge part of what I'm saying. I'm going to give you tools to think. What is in the water? And how do we make sure that everything in the water is brought into God's presence, is transformed by the gospel? That's the goal, right? What's in the water? Well, let's see. I basically say the murky water that's in there. What's in the murky water? I would say it's something like some kind of an Asian heritage, right? I mean, it doesn't matter if you're Chinese, if you're Filipino, if you're Vietnamese, you have some kind of an Asian heritage, right? And some of that actually is not a Christian heritage. Some of it is Christian heritage, right? If you are Indian American, I'm Indian Australian, and you're from like Kerala, Indian Christianity is old, like 2,000 years old. It's really old. So their heritage is Christianity, but it's also Hinduism because it's Christianity that interacted with Hinduism, right? Even if you come from an old, historic church, even in terms of Korea or China, it's Christianity that's interacted with Buddhism and Confucianism, not because we want to, but because it's in the water, right? And so when we say, oh, you're being, subtle Asian traits, what are these subtle traits? And so, because when you say subtle Asian traits, what do you mean particularly? Are they just a bunch of stereotypes? Now, there is something there because stereotypes actually have truth in them, but it's problematic, right? So because I know it's an Australian thing and it got really popular and, it's like thousands of people follow it. And I'm like, they're trying to articulate something, but they don't have precise language. So it ends up being kind of stereotypical, right? And this is dangerous. So I looked at it and I was like, oh, it's funny, but it's also racist. You have to be careful, right? It's how you kind of make fun of yourself. It's okay if it's internal to community, but you have to be careful because some of the language you use isn't actually beneficial. So the question is, what are these things that are in the water? I generally tell people I spent a decade learning Confucianism because I knew as a Korean American, Confucianism was important, but I didn't have language for it. It took me a long time, and I realized, okay, not that I care about Confucianism, but I needed to kind of identify what these things were. And then I have to say, okay, I know what it is now. How do I bring this with the gospel? Right? If I don't know how to talk about anything, I end up saying stuff like this. I might be like, well, those subtle Asian traits. I mean, how do you actually do theology with subtle Asian traits? It's too vague, right? If you say, my friend used to say, well, that Chinese thing, that thing is bad. My grandma, it smells like tiger balm and mushrooms and mushrooms and weird things like that. That's what Chinese is. And I'm like, that's ridiculous. China is like this, and the newer immigrants will tell you that's like ridiculous. The older immigrants talk like that, but the newer immigrants like, no, that's like China from like 50 years ago. That's not how China is. By the way, which is part of what it is, right? I talk about in the book that a lot of times Asian heritage that our parents have is in a time capsule. So if your family came from Hong Kong, like in 70s, they think Chinese culture or Hong Kong culture is like from 50 years ago. And they'll be like, oh, Grace, you're not being Chinese. I'm like, no, nobody in China does that anymore. Like that's something that's old. People in Hong Kong look at you like, no, nobody does that. But your parents will say, oh, you're not being Chinese. And you're like, no, people in China don't do that. Right? My parents went to Korea. Our family came, because we're an immigrant and came in the 80s. And so my parents' Korea is 40 years ago, okay? They visit Korea like, I don't know, 20s later, and they come back and they're like, oh, my Korean name is Tongwoo. Like, Tongwoo, like, you are more Korean. You're the real Korean. And I was like, Mom, that's nonsense. I can't be more authentically Korean than the people in Korea. That's the real thing, right? But what they forgot was the fact that Korea keeps on moving, whereas the Korea of their mind is stuck in time. And what's even more weirder is that the second generation, when they talk about Chineseness, they refer to the Chineseness of their parents, not China right now. So they're fighting over this ancient Chinese thing from 50 years ago, when in fact, why are you fighting over this time capsule thing? And that's basically why some of the people ask about the newer Chinese. They're like, what are you talking about? Nobody does it in China. You are fighting over something from 50 years ago. Nobody does that anymore, right? And some of our churches want to hold on to that. I mean, you can, but that's not contextualization. That's something just you holding on to the past. That's not necessarily good ministry, right? So if you fight over that, first and second generation, or even the newer immigrants or not, you just have to see the fact that you're holding on to the past. That doesn't mean, or at least you understand what you're holding on to is not necessarily Chineseness. It's Chineseness from 40 years ago. Let's just be accurate, at least, in terms of what we're talking about, right? That's really, really important. By the way, somebody asked, is all this thing that we're talking about better? Like, and are there like many Asian American leaders going into ministry? Actually, unfortunately, it's not true. A lot of people are not going into ministry. I think the people going to the pastorate has gotten significantly lower. People who are thinking about contextual stuff, even though we have tons of resources here, are quite low. They're still totally whitewashed Asian American pastors. So, yeah, even in California. So this is kind of an uphill battle. And I just tell people, I'm not trying to make you more Asian American or more Asian. That's not what the point is. I just need all of you in Christ. That's what the struggle is, right? So that was one of the questions people asked. So actually, the Asian heritage, whatever it is, and I'm not saying you should embrace it. I'm just saying you should know it, right? I'm not saying you should be like this. So somebody said, well, how do we make sure that our children don't assimilate? I'm like, to some degree, I don't know if you can stop that. Because later generation, are you going to stop fourth generation from keeping that or not? I think the goal, I always tell people the goal is for us to honor all of who we are. But I don't know what that looks like, right? If you're like fourth generation later on, I think it is important for you to honor your Filipino-ness, Vietnamese-ness, Chinese-ness, or whatever, and not react. Because sometimes when you're in the white dominant context, you want to erase parts of yourself. And that is not good for your discipleship. But how you negotiate and keep this part and honor this heritage is going to look different for generations. And this is naturally going to happen. And if you try to fight that, that's not necessarily good ministry. It's just ethnocentricity. So I would say that's a different idol. And you have to figure out, well, now if they're fighting it and they want to abandon everything Chinese, I would say, okay, that's a different kind of a problem too, right? Because you do have to kind of honor all of who you are and bring peace, so you're not fighting within yourself, right? So Asian heritage, how do you acknowledge it, own it in some way, and bring that in Christ? Migration experience. There's a recent movie that came out called Past Lives in the US. It was talking about this person that immigrated over when she was a teen, and she had this like boyfriend, I guess, in a sense, and back in Korea. But I mean, I just watched it last past weekend. It was, and I thought it was like a romance movie, but it's not. It's really talking about the loss of migration. That you lose something huge when you migrate over. Now, if you're transnational and you have tons of money, it doesn't really matter as much. But people who immigrate, like our parents' generation or whatever, they lose something. They gain something, but they lose something as well. And articulating that's really important, because when you lose something, then that's why sometimes psychologically you try to hold on to this thing for your kids, later generation, and you actually, because you didn't get all the things you wanted, you dumped them in the later generation. I want you to succeed because I wasn't able to succeed because I sacrificed too much to be here. So all this stuff is what we talk about. And so that's really important to kind of understand that there are layers of this thing, right? Yeah. And then, there are things like just Australian culture. And, like all of us, you're bicultural. So I think that's all part of who you are as well, right? I don't know how much you like rugby or, like the things that you watch, like Australian food, Barbie, all this different stuff. It's part of who you are. Are you not being Asian Australian if you like this stuff? Of course, this is part of who you are, right? So there's nothing wrong with that. And you are a hybrid people. This is all part of who you are. And it's going to be like, that's all fine. Once again, it's a matter of how do you make sure that you see these things. And sometimes when churches say, oh, why are you trying to hold on to Asian culture? Why don't you have gospel culture? They typically mean, why don't you become whiter? And I say, well, I mean, gospel culture is important, but as long as you're not identifying that as how white churches do it, right? That's kind of problematic. The last thing is racialization. I think in Australia, you don't talk about it as much, but most definitely it's there. Because as a state, they don't really keep it, they don't really emphasize it, but you see the legacy of it. White Australia policy. I mean, literally, you could not immigrate into Australia because for a huge chunk of time, they definitely didn't want Asians there, right? That's a racist policy. We had the same thing in the US as well, right? US's first immigration law they've ever had was against Asians. Chinese Exclusion Act was the first immigration law. Before that, they didn't even have immigration laws. They created the thing called immigration laws to keep out Asians. And when they kept out Asians and when they passed that law, they celebrated by saying, yes, hooray, America is white. That's what the newspaper said, right? So as though like the US, United States was a white nation to begin with, right? Because, obviously it's a settler colonial state, right? Just like Australia. So whether it be xenophobia, whether it be white indigenous tension, legacy, right? Because that's part of who you are and you see it happening in front of you. And so the question is, where do you fit in? Where does Peter fit in, right? I'm going to pick on Peter all day long. He's not white. He's not indigenous. He's not Aborigines. Where should you fit in? And so people asked about this. What is the place of First Nations for, Asian Australians, right? I think it's important to realize the fact that, well, we have some more privilege. We don't have as much of a legacy, and especially if you're relatively well off, you're gonna be a lot more have privilege. And the question is, are you gonna just basically say, well, who cares about the average of these people? Then you're gonna own all the oppressive legacy of the white Australians. Then you're guilty of that as well. So the Asian Australian church has to figure out what you want to do. Do you just say, I don't care? Because then you're going to be guilty of everything else as well. You can't be like, they're guilty and we're not, because you're benefiting from what they've done in the past. The same thing that we talk about in the US. What US did to Black Americans, what US they did to Native Americans. We always talk about the fact that the Asian American church has to own that, right? If you don't own it, you're guilty of everything. And so that's a really hard struggle. It's not difficult to do, right? It's not difficult to kind of just process. No, it's quite difficult to process. It's not easy to just kind of deal with. Whether it be the bamboo ceiling, whether it be white supremacy you see. And I read an article, I think this week, because I was preparing for this, and there was an article talking about the fact that, hey, there's less racism in Australia against Asians. Celebrating it. They said, oh, in 2020, there was like 17% physical attacks, but now it's only 16%. And I was like, what? That's good? Like, that's progress? It's 3%. So now it's only like 15% physical attacks. I was like, you thought this is a good thing. Like, I don't understand. Like, I mean, I'm appalled, right? So there is definitely racism happening, but because Australia doesn't talk about race that much, you have less language for it, right? And that's not good, because US was like that before, but US started talking about all the racial dynamics after they passed the 1964 Civil Rights Act, after MLK, after Martin Luther King Jr. did all this activism. US said, okay, this race thing is real. We should keep track of everything, and we need language for it. Because if we don't, we will oppress people and not have language for it. All right. So anyways, all this is happening. And my biggest argument for Asians everywhere in the diaspora, whether it be Asian Australians or Asian Americans or Asian Canadians, Asian British people, I'm like, look, you need to understand who you are and where you are. And because our education is so whitewashed, if you just, even like people who are like graduated from Harvard at US, they know almost zero Asian American history. US has like 170 years of Asian American history. They don't know anything, right? They don't know that all the Asian Americans fought for their rights. They protested multiple times. They don't know any of that stuff, right? So they only know whatever the stereotypical ideas about Asia is by the media. And that's not good, because we don't know ourselves. So that's the biggest challenge. Somebody asked, what do you think is the biggest challenge to Asian Australian Christians? I think this is the same challenge that we have in the US, right? They can't articulate even their experience. What is happening to me, right? Now we need what is happening to us in God, but we can't even bring it to God because the language we have is pretty much like we have no words for these things, right? I just feel like something bad is happening. Well, what bad is happening, right? So the more language that you have, describe what's happening. Like somebody asked, how can somebody who basically is in a white denomination? Oh yeah, how can Asian Australian Christians contribute to creating a less Anglo-centric culture in a mainstream denomination culture? Well, first of all, you have to know yourself well, and you have to be able to articulate who you are, so you can actually say specifically what has to change. If you just say things like, well, stereotypically, then like I tell people, typically even my students, even people who have college education, they come with kindergarten level articulation. They say, well, that's very Chinese. I'm like, Chinese? China has 5,000 years of history. It's the Middle Kingdom. What do you mean Chineseness, right? I mean, this is how I grew up. I was like, oh, it's so Korean. I'm like, I don't know anything about Korea. I grew up here, I don't know anything about Korean history. So I'll say everything, because I grew up in a white context. I say everything negative is Korean and everything positive is, oh, that guy is that girl's so Americanized. Oh, yeah. That guy's so Korean. Oh, no. Who wants that fob stuff? That's how I grew up. And I realized that's literally like kindergarten level. That good, this bad. I'm like, who talks that way? Well, a lot of you are college graduates. I mean, you know about European history, you know about Enlightenment, you know about multiculturalism. But when you talk about our own experience, we can't articulate this in a graduate level. Because we can't talk this way, we can't think about our faith that way. We just know something hurts. So typically, we will blame our Asian culture because that's what sticks out. And white Australia keeps on telling you, oh, you're different because of your culture. I'm like, but we don't even know it ourselves that well. So we're like, I guess that's what the problem is. So we say, oh, it must be our shame culture. It must be our heritage because Hillsong looks great. So compared to that, we seem to have weird problems. So the weirdness must come from Asian experience. So that must be the culprit. And I'm like, maybe, but there are other things happening. It might be migration. It might be the fact that we're actually having a racial experience, but we have no words for it, right? I mean, if you're like one of the very few, maybe you were growing up in a very multicultural neighborhood. Like, I live in a majority Asian neighborhood, okay? I live in the most Asian place in the US. My kids go to majority Asian elementary school, high school. A couple of years ago, this is when they had good school food and local schools are organizing it. They organized so that they can have Vietnamese pho for lunch at the public school. That's how Asian it is. The PTA organizes, this is just, because it's like, what, 80% Asian? When they organize fundraisers in the school, they have boba tea for the whole school. This is what they do, okay? That's the kind of school that my kids go to. How much Asian American history do you think they know? And school teachers? Very little. Very little. Because the curriculum is still pretty white. And I'm like, this is crazy. How are these kids going to know their place in the world? How are they going to know anything about how to be the kind of a citizen, let alone Christian, right? It's very difficult to know. Okay, this is my biggest argument for everybody. You start with this, and then you can figure out how do we think through, right? And every single aspect of it, you need like a very sophisticated way of thinking about it, right? Not like, oh, I mean, like I said, I spent 10 years. Hopefully I can teach you Confucianism faster because I had to research it for 10 years. But those nuances are what we're trying to understand, right? So there you go. Asian Australian quadrilateral. Now, I have this book called Asian American Quadrilateral, right? And the whole idea is this. Often people only use Asian heritage to do their theology. And I'm just saying, hey, maybe that is the problem. But it might be other problems too. Some of the things that people are talking about in terms of like, oh, generational conflict and stuff, it actually is common for every kind of immigrant. It is not just unique to Asian Australians. So you might have tools for that that's slightly different. So you can't actually blame Asianness for that. That's just being an immigrant, right? And those tools to deal with migration is slightly different, as opposed to tools dealing with Asian heritage, tools dealing with Australian culture, tools dealing with race. It's slightly different, and you can't use the same tools for that, right? It's like I tell people, like, it is possible to use a hammer to hammer in a screw. It is possible. I looked it up on the internet. But that's not good because that's not what a screw is, right? Anyways, I call this, and it varies, right? All this difference varies depending on what your experience is and what your heritage is and everything else, where you are in the country. Maybe, I mean, I saw that most of you live in the coast because I don't know if anybody lives in the middle of Australia, right? But let's say you do. Like somehow your family went in the middle of it. Your experience will be radically different than if you were born in grew up in Melbourne, right? Or if you were first generation or second generation or third generation, right? And so we call this the quadrilateral, and they overlap, and they kind of end up being a way you see the world, right? That's why how Peter sees the world is different than how Cindy sees the world. How Grace it's slightly different, right? I mean, I wear glasses, as you can see. So this is called a phoropter. I didn't even know what it was. I had to look it up, right? Is it one? So what's your prescription, right? And so even among your siblings or your friends, they might see the world slightly different because they have a slightly different experience, even though all these 4 themes still matter for them. And then I say, this is why you experience certain people that way. That's why first generation, feels are very different than second generation, as opposed to more the recent immigrant. They feel different. And you can call this worldview or whatever. I'm just trying to say the worldview is not one thing. It's multiple things, right? There's multiple things happening and it's unique to people, right? And so you might be like, oh, generally people in, Brisbane kind of think this way. It might be true, right? But there's discrepancies in terms of people as well and families. So you hold those lightly and saying, oh, generally there are themes, generation, because Gen X or Gen Z, I don't know if you do generations over there. Did you get Grace? Yes, yeah. So Gen Alpha now, right? So my kid's Gen Alpha, and it's wild, just bizarre how they think about the world, right? So you think about these things and try to locate where people are. And then I say, what are the particular coordinates? So this is basically why your experience is different than my experience. Why my kids living in a majority Asian American town is totally different if you grew up in the middle of America. So I tell people, I can only give you tools, but I can't tell you, I can give you some idea because I'm doing this for a long time, but my solution can't be replicated over where you are because it's slightly different, right? So I can't do your homework for you. I can help you train it. We can exchange notes, but somebody else can't do your theology for you, right? So I'm trying to, we try to talk about how we equip people in a sense. And so last thing, and then I'll open up for kind of Q&A. What does our Asian Australian ministry look like in the light of this? I'm only going to hint at certain things and kind of give you just a list, and then I'll open it up for different things, right? Because obviously this is all kind of ramifications. I think the idea is, what are the places where we hurt? Where are the places where we hurt? How does all these things impact how you see God? Because ministry at the end of the day is about how you see God and what you think God wants from you, right? For example, so I talk about this, like a lot of Asian Australian churches, I would say, I presume, maybe I'm wrong, but I presume that a lot of Asian Australian churches are culturally and relationally, right? Culturally and like relationally Australian, Asian, but I don't think we end up being theologically and spiritually Asian Australian. Does that make sense? Like we like eating food, we like hanging out, but it doesn't necessarily impact our theology and how we do ministry. And what I'm trying to say is that, what is the point of having Asian Australian churches if we're not thinking about what God is helping us to do to bring about more deeper healing, transformation, and gifting for the people? I actually don't think that any church should be exclusive, but you can actually have more missional focus on certain things. And I don't even think that churches should necessarily have to label themselves as Chinese or Asian or whatever, but you should be like, hey, we know who our people are, and these are the people in front of us, so where are they at? What waters do they swim in? And how do we make sure that we help them articulate the gospel where they are, right? So regarding their particular hurts, where they hurt, where are the sins, and what are the gifts? And how do we think about them in an explicit way? I'm going to give you 3 examples just for us to kind of just get you thinking. The first thing is our view of God. I generally say that, there was a famous, white pastor, Tim Keller is pretty famous. He's traveled around the world. And Tim Keller's church, my wife got baptized there. Like I know Tim Keller's church, Redeemer, really well, right? And I've listened to Tim Keller for like a decade. And I was like, and there's a moment and when I realized, oh, that church was 50% Asian. I don't know if you knew that. It was actually one of the biggest Asian American churches in the country but the weird thing is, I actually don't think he actually understood who the people really were. I remember this one sermon very distinctively. He said, oh, God is not a boss. God's a father. God can't fire you. And I listened to the sermon. I said to myself, Tim, half the congregation is Asian, right? Like, I mean, I'm not saying all the fathers are bad, but our fathers can't fire us. Like, they disown us. Like, it happens, right? Or relationally disown us. Like, it's a real thing. I don't know what you're talking about. Like, I mean, I tell people there are times in my life where I knew if I had a problem with my white boss, I can take him to HR. I can't take my Korean dad to HR. Like, what do I do with this guy, right? So he thought that saying father meant something, but he totally misunderstood what was happening. And because if he actually did pastoral ministry, because at Redeemer he didn't, he had a whole department of counselors. He didn't do pastoral ministry. He just read and lectured, right? So if he did that, he would know it does not work. It does not work that way, right? Just saying that God's a father doesn't actually mean what you think it means. This is where there are things like this where, some white ministries might be like, oh, fatherhood of God. I'm like, we're Asian. We got to unpack that. It can't be like a passing comment. You might need to do it like every other year. You might have to do like a 20-part series. I mean, I'm joking, but you have to really unpack this thing. You have to really, like, it's not just saying that God's good, God's a father doesn't help us. Like I'm saying, we accept these things and we say, wait a minute, does that really work? Like it's fraught, it's complicated. That has to be unpacked. And so it's great the fact that you're a white famous pastor, but your context is different. I can learn from you, but I can't copy you. Because your people and how you think is so different than me and my people. And it's not because my people are messed up. It's that my people are different contexts. And your resources are for a different community, right? The second thing is family. People don't realize the fact that family matters so much. And so much of Western white dominant theology doesn't really include family that much. In terms of even our discipleship, right? Family is like a afterthought. And I'm like, no. It matters a lot for us. You need to give us resources to figure out how do we parent, how do we do intergenerational marriage? I mean, intergenerational kind of conflict, all this different stuff. We need so much more resources. I'm a theologian. I'm a systematic theologian. That's my training. And I talk about the fact that Western Protestant theology doesn't even have a category for family. They don't even care about family, right? It's purely individualistic. But it turns out that if you're Catholic, because of the Holy Family, they do have a robust family theology. Now, I don't agree with everything, but they care about family, I'm saying. It's not the fact that it's actually like, if you read Calvin, family just doesn't exist that much. And you realize, oh, this is a problem. This is a problem of how people do theology, because there's a lot of family in the Bible, but Western theology is so individualistic, they don't think about how important family is and how we live out our discipleship. This we need. We need it for our people. And if you copy white resources, it will not help you, because how they talk about family doesn't mean it's for them. It's not for us. So this is basically, you have to figure this out. And our hurts and pains and gifts, once again, we have to figure this out. Last thing is Sabbath, because I want to make sure that we get to kind of Q&A. Sabbath is so important because when you immigrate, and the type of people who immigrate, you get in a survivalist mentality. You work really hard. And to some degree, even in Australia or the US, we have to work hard because, we have to compete with white people, basically, in a sense. It's true. Like, because, a lot of parents, they either explicitly say it or they kind of know it's there. And a lot of kids absorb it. They know they have to work twice as hard as white people to actually succeed. They won't get hired, right? And the research shows the fact that for the same job, like Asian Americans are like a lot more educated to get the same job as a white person, right? That compensates for the fact that there's a racial minority, right? Now, given that, it can be very, it can be taxing because we can kind of drive ourselves hard, right? And in that sense, we can drive ourselves hard in ministry. We can drive ourselves hard because the immigrant mentality is more of a survivalist mentality. And that really goes against the gospel. It can make the ministry very legalistic. It can make the ministry like just life-sucking. When you realize the Sabbath is such a fundamental idea. So I talk about Sabbath a lot for Asian Americans because of modern minority myth and all this. It really drives us to perform. And of course, performing is good, but it becomes kind of a weird idol. And also it becomes really, really toxic, right? So at churches, we can't celebrate that. We have to be careful. You can't be like, oh, it's great. You know, Peter went to a wonderful college. Let's all celebrate. I'm like, wait a minute. We can celebrate that, but let's make sure we're not making that an idol, because if we're making performance an idol, achievement an idol, that is our sin. Nobody would see it as a sin, but we know in our community it's a sin. So other people don't know, but we know ourselves it's a sin, so we have to be careful, right? Those are the ways in which we think very specific and contextual about where we are, right? Because if we don't do it that way, if you just copy somebody else's ministry, I mean, I think I've learned so much from Tim Keller. I've learned so much from different people. I learn from everybody. But what I know is the fact that their ministry is not universal to everybody. They're ministering a particular people. It's contextual to a particular people. I have to figure out what is contextual to my people. That's what I'm arguing for, right? Not even making ourselves more Asian, but what are the struggles of our people, and how do we allow that to drive how we do ministry? I think last comment is that a lot of pastors do this intuitively. They know they have to do it, but what I want to do is make this very explicit so we know how to do it well. All right, so that is the presentation, and and like I said, I will share this with you. But a lot of it is in my book as well.
Thank you so much, Dr. Lee. Yeah, I feel like we've received an incredible blessing and service from you this morning. Thank you so much for giving us this robust framework which to know ourselves, our communities, and then like you said, bring all of these corners to God so that we can understand our hurts, sins, and gifts for healing, transformation, and gifting. I love it, even though I've heard some of it before, but I felt, what a blessing. It's time for Q&A. I might just start with the people that are here and give you guys a chance to ask questions first.
Let me see here. I know there's some comments here as well.
Yeah, perhaps we could start.
Let me address that.
Crystal's one.
Our identity matters to God. How do we disciple people without holding our identity? Yeah, that's very important. Okay, two things about contextualizing. People always ask, isn't it dangerous? I'm like, absolutely. Is there a dangerous syncretism? Absolutely. It's so dangerous. But what we have right now is already contextualized. It's already happened. What you have right now is already contextualized for white Australia. It's already happened. So that's dangerous too. So whether you don't do it or not, it's dangerous everywhere, right? People think, oh, I'm not going to do it. I'm like, oh, wait, it's already happened. All the white influence is already in the Christianity you already have. Therefore, the question is, well, what do? I'm like, well, we got to pray. We got to pray, and we got to basically discern. We have to learn from other people as well as discern where we are. But there's no avoiding danger. I think people think, well, I'm going to just follow, be biblical. I'm like, it doesn't work that way, right? So I think that's one of the biggest things I always kind of emphasize. People think, oh, isn't it dangerous? I'm like, oh, it's dangerous, all right. Now, I do think, so you were interacting with the context. Contextual, I think some people think that contextualization means like watering down the gospel to make it more palpable to context. I actually don't think of it that way. I think of it as sometimes, so in one sense, it's to make it understandable to a context. Another sense, I would say it's critiquing the context even more sharply, right? This is what the sin is, because a general idea of sin doesn't help us. So sometimes contextualization means, oh, this is how you sin. This is how you are hurting. So it's making it a lot more pointed. It's not just watering it down so it's easier for us, because we're trying to go for transformation, right? So I think that's one of the biggest misconceptions about contextualization, right? Like think about achievement being, or achievement or even obedience. I talk about obedience sometimes being a sin for Asian Americans, right? Like the prodigal son story, I use it a lot. The older son, oldest son is obedient, doing everything, and lost. That's a weird idea, but once you understand that, that can happen in our churches. Because a lot of it, Asian Australia might be very moral. And I'm like, see, this is where we have to be very pointed at how the gospel has to be proclaimed for us. So that kind of thing is basically what we mean by big contextualization. So given that, yeah, I don't think the goal is not to be Asian per se, or even like, value Asians. I'm like, I think it's important because sometimes healing comes by affirming our heritage. When if you live in a white context and you feel like you've been attacked for so long, I think having healing come can be really, really important. But at the same time, like what do you call it? I think the goal is not to be like more Chinese. I think that's a problem, right? Okay, so given that, that's basically what it is. Yeah, I've seen people, yeah, hold on to it. Like I said, I mean, sometimes certain aspects of it maybe has to be critiqued. But I would say when you critique your Asian heritage or Chineseness, just make sure you're not critiquing it based on white context. Like you say, this is Christian, white context is Christian, and yours is not. That's very, very common, right? So you're not normalizing white values, and you're really critiquing Chinese values based on white Australian values. That would be racism. It would be internalized racism. That would be toxic, right? Because that white Australian church is not a picture of heaven. That's already contextualized for them, right? So that's probably one of the most important points. In the book, I talk about it. It's the contextuality, but there's a thing called normativity. What normally gets passed as being like, what normally passes as being normal, and that's invisible. So seeing that is really, really important. I'll jump in that one. Second question: second generation Korean born to refugee.
Not really a question, just a comment. But
yeah. I in my book I talk about this. There actually is migration. There also is this refugee experience, and it's very important to realize the fact that to distinguish the two. Right, refugee experience is not just harder migration. Like it's a different kind of experience. So how do we make sure we see that? How do we make sure when we have Asian Australian groups, the fact that we are different, we don't actually just project my experience upon other people. The story I always tell is the fact that I met a Hmong American, OUN, and I was like, I had no idea, and I was just showing my profound ignorance because I just had absolutely no clue, and I realized, oh, this is me being ignorant. This is me showing my East Asian privilege. Like, oh, you must be like me. And I'm like, no, they're not like you, right? So for me to learn on a journey, to be respectful, to be not assume, right? That's been a long journey for me. And so I think especially in certain spaces like this, where I would say like Chinese Australians, for example, might take up a lot of space, I would be very, very careful. I tell East Asian Americans or Korean Americans, you're the white people of Asian America. So you have to really think about your privilege. You think about how much room you take. You can't project yourself upon other people. Otherwise, the minority Asian Americans or minority Asian Australians will feel marginalized. So I'm very sensitive about that, right? So that's something you probably all want to think about, because I think some of the future of Asian American ministry and future of Asian Australian ministry, I think, is for us to be able to go beyond our ethnic boundaries. Maybe you have a Chinese American church and Chinese Australian church, and you realize, oh, you know what? Maybe in a sense, it's difficult for like white Australians to come, but we are able to attract, Vietnamese Australians. That might be interesting, right? Some of that's already happening in the US, but I'm like, I think people don't realize this is a possibility. And I'm like, you have to really tend to that and be like, how do we support? How do we reach out? I've been the biggest advocate for like Filipino Americans because I'm Korean American. I have a lot of privilege in one sense. I'm always trying to figure out how to support other minoritized Asian Americans, right? I think something you have to think about that for yourself, right?
Let's go to Cindy's question. What advice would you give to a white Australian ministry pastoring first and second generation Asian congregations, I guess, or Christians?
I think the biggest thing is for the pastor to realize you're white. And that's a particular thing. You're not neutral. You come from a particular context with particular, the more that person understands who or she or he or she is, the better it'll be for the ministry. Because what's going to happen a lot of times when you have a white Australian minister, it's like, oh, I am normal. I'm just Christian, but you are Asian. That's what often what ends up happening. So you're like, oh, that's weird, but I just have Christian values. I'm like, that's not true. You have white Christian values. So if you see it that way, then it'll actually be more like, they'll be more open to how learning and thinking about the fact that, oh, what I think is normal is not normal. It's actually a very particular white thing, right? It's not even a biblical thing. It's a white thing. So then you can realize, so what does it mean for these people to, kind of live out their faith? That's probably the number one thing that I would say. And then from then on, you have to figure out who the people are. If you learn about the first and second generation Asians without knowing who you are, you come from a particular context, you will be like, oh, these poor Asians, they have to deal with their own pagan culture, whereas I don't. I'm like, no, that is not true. That is not true at all. And it'll be very oppressive and it'll be very problematic. I see this all the time. And that's what the first thing I say. You are particular. You are not universal. You're not generic. You come from a particular context.
That's very helpful. Yeah. So the Anglo-Australians amongst us also have work to do, not just Asian Australians, to understand our particular contexts.
Oh yeah, I forgot to Victor. I should have been reading because I think for the video, because I don't always have what I what's in front of me. Yeah, the question about what advice would you give? Yeah, I'll try to read the question as it goes along as well.
Oh, good. We'll go to Silfong's question now. Said, I think it's probably true that some Asian Australian Christians tend to uphold a gospel-centered ministry without knowing that it is actually quite white-centered and not necessarily contextualized. Do you think that's true, and what can we do about it?
I think it's absolutely true. I think it's absolutely true. Now, I'm a Reformed theologian. I love Luther. I literally I'm teaching a class right now on Luther, Bonhoeffer, and I think there's something to learn there, right? But what I can't do is copy Luther, right? So it's fine, learn from everybody. But I know he's a medieval German theologian. I don't think I'm as the theologian, even though I love Luther. I'm like, that's his context. I think there are things that I can learn, but what that looks like in my context is going to look different. That's the difference, right? But what you have to do is realize the fact that there are issues here. There are multiple issues here. And if you don't see that, you will tell people about gospel-centeredness, but it's really just white values. This happens a lot. It happens all the time, actually. It's basically why, as much as I love all the gospel-centered stuff and Luther as well, it just drives me insane. So how are you going to argue against people who say, well, let's make gospel, let's be Christocentric. Let's be gospel-centered. It sounds great, but that's not what's happening. And so, once again, you can learn a lot from that perspective, but just be careful. A kingdom culture, gospel culture, I'm like, yeah, I believe in all that stuff, right? But as long as you know that when you say that, you probably just mean white kingdom culture, white gospel culture, right? I want gospel Asian culture. I want our transformation to happen, because even if you impose that, our context won't change. The places where we have to be transformed won't be transformed. So it's not trying to become Asian. I want the Asian stuff to be transformed by the gospel, and that won't happen. That's basically why I push for it. It's not like I want the Asian stuff to stay the same. Do you understand? Because those things are addressing somebody else's pain, somebody else, and some of that does overlap with our experience. But those idols sometimes are not our idols, and our idols have to come down. So we need very specific tools to target our idols too, right? And our pains. So that's basically why we talk about contextualization. It's not just watering it down so it'd be easier for us. That's not contextualization. That's literally just watering it down, right? And that's not good preaching of the gospel. You want to confront people correctly, right? You don't want to stumble people. And somebody asked about they were as a missionary. Yeah, the problem is gospel preaching, gospel work is all about stumbling people correctly, because gospel will stumble people. What you want to do is stumble people with the gospel and not stumble people with white culture or Western values. If they stumble over that, you did it wrong. Why'd you do it wrong? Because they didn't stumble over the gospel, and Christ, who is his message, the gospel, is going to stumble over. You stumbled over white values. Well, that's terrible then. They didn't even hear the gospel. You have to figure this out so that they can stumble over Christ. And you were stumbled. The message of grace is offensive because it makes you a beggar, and nobody wants to be a beggar. So that's why we have to think about this, all the context stuff, just so that we can do it correctly, stumble people for the right reasons, right?
Yeah, thank you so much for that. I just have a final question, and then we might finish there. There are some people joining, I guess, outside of Australia, or they might be on the mission field, and so, do you have any early thoughts on, I guess, bringing Asian Australian cells on the mission field and what that looks like in the context of what you've been talking about? Yeah.
Yes, I do have lots to say about this. I just spent some time with some of the Asian American missionary leaders. They were like, top executive of like mission agencies. I think one of the biggest things I always tell missionaries anywhere is, first of all, know yourself well. Once again, right? Let's say you're Asian Australian and you serve in Japan. Know yourself well. How you are formed. How much of Australian culture is in you. How much of white racism in you. Because it's in you because you have to survive. Like, I don't blame, Asian Americans for having internalized racism and trying to be white. What else would you do? You're a kid, you're trying to survive, So in a sense, you're trying to be white because otherwise you'll get beat up. I mean, literally, physically get beat up sometimes. So you can't blame a kid for that. But with that mentality, when you grow up, you might still have all that in you. And when you go over to missions, you're still going to have that mentality in you. You have to know yourself well. And what you're trying to do sometimes is that you still think that culture is weird because you're normalizing white Australia. You have to attend to yourself first, right? And then because you know yourself well, you can use all of who you are to connect with them. You can leverage your gifts. Because what ends up happening so often is that when you live in a white country like US or Australia, you value whiteness. You value trying to be white. And you kind of see parts of yourself as kind of like literally trash. Like, I don't want this. I don't want parts of myself. The problem is, what you consider to be trash is your gift. That is what makes you different. If you're going to try to be white, at best, you'll be a sad imitation of a white person. Right? I mean, it's a copy, right? If you're trying to copy somebody else, at best, you're only a copy. Like, I want Peter Liu to be the best Asian Australian, not a copy of a white Australian, because that at best, that's all you are. Your gifts come as you own all of who you are, but that's very difficult to do because parts of ourselves has caused us so much pain, whether it be because internally within our own community, our parents' generation or whatever, or because outside is so white. Dealing with the healing of that and making sure that all this we're integrated together. Now, all of who we are can be used for God's kingdom. And that's what has to happen for our missionaries too. I mean, everybody in Australia, that has to happen, but also for our missionaries as well. If we don't do that, then you will project your pains and normative, all that upon the culture. And you will do it without thinking about it because this is what you grew up thinking. So that's not going to be good. Now, given that after you've done that work, then you can think about the same thing that we're doing for our context, learn the context, trying to figure out what are the connection points here, right? And what part of the gospel that's not even in my training, does it resonate with the people? And make sure that they're stumbling over the right things because they should stumble. That's how transformation and conversion happens, but they have to stumble over the right thing. It can't be my explanation of the gospel, some white version of it, but an explanation of the gospel that makes sense to them that they stumble over, right? So that's why I say this self-knowledge thing is very, very difficult because, like some of you already have graduate educations. You should have gotten you should have graduate level education of what it means to be Asian Australian. But honestly, do you have that? No, it's like literally impossible because your education was pretty much white. That's how it is in the US. So I tell people, like, there was somebody I was training, they're like 50s, right? In their 50s, and she was so sad. She said, I finally know who I am. All of my ministry, I had no idea how to even talk about myself. And I'm like, well, thank God you know it now, right? But with all that experience and training, she still had so little knowledge of who she was. And so we want that to be there for our leaders. And then you can still disagree about certain things, but at least you have an idea of who you are. You understand, Asian Australian history, you understand culture, you understand migration dynamics, and that's basically what you have to do.
Thank you so much. And yeah, I guess it really, encourages us to consider how we prepare people for the field, in our theological colleges and so forth. Because yeah, absolutely, there's no real space to do that at the moment, and a lot of it is we've got to do the work. All right, so we've come to the end. So if you haven't checked out Dr. Lee's book already, please have a look. It's published by RP Academic, and yeah, recently won an award from the Asian Theological Society. That's congrats on that.
Well, actually, it wasn't the Asian Theological Society. It was actually
American.
It was the American Theological Society.
American Theological Society. Yeah.
Yeah.
Thanks for pointing that out. I'd like to suggest some next steps. Later today, you'll receive an email from us about a post-lecture survey, and this will help the Center for Asian Christianity here at BST know how to serve you and your ministry context better. And so, yeah, please, that would help us a lot if you could go through that. It should only take 5 minutes. So Dr. Lee has really encouraged us to do a lot of work in our own context, and perhaps you'd like to continue the conversation with other practitioners or academics. If you have any, please let us know in the feedback form, and CAC can, consider ways in how we can facilitate that. If you have any suggestions or other topics or guests CAC could host, we'd love to know. And finally, I encourage you to connect with us through our Facebook page, Instagram and website. And I'd also like to give a shout out to acknowledge and thank the Melbourne School of Theology for co-sponsoring this lecture with us, and we very much value this collaboration. So please check them out on their socials and website as well. Thank you all for this morning, and all the best in your ministry areas, and we hope to connect with you again soon. Thank you very much, everyone. Yeah, and thank you, Dr. Lee. We appreciate you so much.
Thank you so much for having me. Appreciate it.
Thank you.